No one ever imagines that love can walk into their life disguised as an emergency, carried on a stretcher, wrapped in pain and urgency. But for David, that is exactly how everything began. David had chosen medicine not just as a career, but as a calling. He believed in saving lives, in being present during people's most fragile moments, in offering calm when everything else felt like chaos. Young, dedicated, and respected among his colleagues, he moved through the hospital with precision and purpose, rarely allowing himself to be distracted by anything outside his responsibilities. His life was structured, controlled, and defined by routine. Day after day, he treated patients, made decisions under pressure, and carried the quiet weight that comes with being responsible for the well-being of others. He had seen pain in many forms: physical, emotional, silent, and loud, but he had learned to keep a certain distance. Not out of coldness, but out of necessity, because in his world, becoming too involved could make it harder to do what needed to be done. That day had started like any other. The hospital corridors echoed with hurried footsteps, voices calling out instructions, machines beeping steadily in the background. Everything moved in a familiar rhythm, one that David knew by heart. Until suddenly, everything shifted. A woman was rushed into the emergency room, her condition urgent but stable, her body marked by the impact of a fall. The story came quickly between fragmented words. She had been climbing a ladder, trying to fix her own roof, refusing to wait for help that never came. She lived alone. She had no one to call. Her name was Ellie. When David first saw her, it wasn't just the injury that caught his attention. It was the quiet strength in her expression, even through the pain. There was something in the way she held herself, something resilient, something unspoken. She wasn't complaining, wasn't demanding attention. She simply endured, as if she was used to facing life on her own. David stepped in immediately, focused, professional, doing everything he had been trained to do. He examined her injuries, gave instructions, ensured she was stable. His movements were precise, his voice calm. But somewhere in the middle of all that, something unexpected happened. He noticed her, not just as a patient, not just as someone who needed help, but as a person. Ellie looked at him with a mixture of discomfort and quiet trust. She answered his questions honestly, her voice soft but steady. There was no drama in her words, no exaggeration, just truth. And for reasons he couldn't explain, David found himself listening more closely than usual. As the initial urgency faded and her condition stabilized, the atmosphere around them softened. The chaos of the emergency room moved on to the next case, but something between them lingered. David asked a few more questions than necessary. Ellie gave a few more answers than expected. Their conversation, though simple, carried a subtle connection that neither of them acknowledged out loud. He learned that she lived alone, that she handled everything herself, that asking for help had never been easy for her. She spoke about it casually, as if independence was not a choice, but a necessity life had imposed on her. David felt something shift inside him. He had treated countless patients, heard countless stories, but this one stayed with him. There was no self-pity in her voice, no attempt to gain sympathy, just quiet resilience. As the hours passed and her treatment continued, he found himself checking on her more often than required. Small things at first, making sure she was comfortable, asking if she needed anything. Each interaction brief, professional, but carrying something deeper beneath the surface. Ellie noticed it too, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel seen. For someone who had spent so long handling life alone, that feeling was unfamiliar, almost disarming. For David, it was even more unexpected. He had built his life around control, around focus, around keeping emotions in check. But standing there, beside her hospital bed, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Curiosity, connection, something warm and quiet, yet impossible to ignore. And though neither of them said it, both felt it. Because sometimes, the most important stories don't begin with perfect circumstances. They begin in the middle of chaos, in moments that seem ordinary at first, but carry the power to change everything. And for David and Ellie, This was only the beginning of a story neither of them had planned, but both were about to live. What begins in urgency often leaves behind something quieter, something that lingers long after the chaos fades. And for David, that lingering presence had a name he could no longer ignore. Ellie remained in the hospital for observation, her injuries not life-threatening, but serious enough to require care and rest. The fast pace of the emergency room gave way to slower hours, where conversations had space to exist and silence no longer felt rushed. It was in those quieter moments that something between them began to take shape. David told himself that his attention toward her was professional, that his repeated visits to her room were simply part of his responsibility. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. There were other patients, other cases just as important, yet he found himself drawn back to her again and again, as if something within him refused to stay distant. Ellie noticed his presence long before she said anything about it. She began to recognize the sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the rhythm of his voice, the calm way he spoke even when things were uncertain. There was something grounding about him, something that made the sterile hospital room feel less cold, less lonely. Their conversations started with small things: how she was feeling, whether the pain had improved, if she needed anything. But gradually, those exchanges stretched beyond the expected. David asked about her life, gently at first, careful not to cross boundaries. Ellie answered, sometimes briefly, sometimes with surprising openness, as if speaking to him felt easier than she expected. She told him about the house she lived in, about the constant repairs that never seemed to end, about how she had learned to fix things herself because there had never been anyone else to rely on. She spoke of independence not as pride, but as survival. David listened in a way that made her words feel important. Not interrupted, not analyzed, just heard. And in return, he found himself sharing pieces of his own life, something he rarely did. He spoke about the long years of study, the pressure of always needing to be right, the quiet loneliness that came with dedicating everything to a career that demanded so much. In those conversations, something subtle shifted. They were no longer just doctor and patient. They were two people, both carrying their own versions of solitude, finding an unexpected understanding in each other. Yet, with that growing connection came an invisible line David could not ignore. He was her doctor. There were rules, boundaries, expectations that existed for a reason. He knew that allowing anything beyond professionalism could complicate things, not just for him, but for her as well. And so, he began to pull back slightly. Not completely, not enough for her not to notice, but enough to remind himself where he stood. Ellie felt the change immediately. The visits became shorter, the conversations more reserved, the warmth still there, but carefully contained. She didn't question him directly, but inside, she felt a quiet disappointment she couldn't fully explain. For someone who had spent so long being alone, she had learned not to expect too much from anyone. But David had changed that, even if only for a moment. And now, that distance felt heavier than she wanted to admit. The day of her discharge arrived sooner than either of them expected. The room that had once been filled with uncertainty now held a different kind of tension. The kind that comes when something meaningful is about to end, or perhaps transform into something unknown. David went through the final instructions with her, his voice steady, his tone professional, but his eyes revealing something deeper. He explained what she needed to do, how to take care of herself, when to return if necessary. Everything was precise, correct, exactly as it should be. But when the moment came to say goodbye, neither of them moved immediately. Ellie thanked him, not just for his care, but for something she couldn't fully put into words. For making her feel less alone, even if just for a short time. David nodded, his expression calm, but inside, something resisted that ending. He wanted to say more, to ask something, to not let this become just another patient he would forget over time. But hesitation held him back. Ellie picked up her things slowly, each movement carrying a quiet weight. As she walked toward the door, she paused for a brief second, as if waiting for something, some sign, some reason to turn back. But it didn't come, and so she left. The door closed softly behind her, and just like that, the room felt different. Empty. David stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the space she had occupied, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. It wasn't regret exactly, but it was close. Because sometimes the hardest part is not the connection itself. It's the moment you let it slip away without knowing if it could have become something more. And as David returned to his routine, surrounded once again by the noise and urgency of the hospital, he realized something he could no longer deny. Ellie was no longer just a patient. She had become a question he didn't know how to answer. And soon, that question would demand more than silence. Some connections refuse to fade, no matter how much distance or time tries to silence them. And for David, the absence of Ellie became louder than any presence around him. Days passed, yet something felt incomplete. The hospital continued its relentless rhythm. Patients came and went, decisions were made, lives were saved, but none of it felt the same. David found himself distracted in moments that once required absolute focus. His thoughts drifted without warning, returning again and again to a quiet hospital room, to soft conversations, to a woman who had walked out of his life as suddenly as she had entered it. He tried to convince himself it was nothing unusual. Doctors grow attached to patients sometimes, he told himself. It happens. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. What he felt wasn't concern. It was something deeper, something personal, something he had never allowed himself to explore before. Meanwhile, Ellie returned to her home, carrying more than just physical pain. The house felt colder than she remembered, the silence heavier. She moved carefully, following the instructions she had been given, but every step reminded her of how fragile things could be. Not just her body, but her life. For years, she had managed everything on her own, fixing what broke, solving what went wrong, carrying burdens without asking for help. But now something had changed. She missed him, not in a dramatic or overwhelming way, but in small, quiet moments. When she made coffee in the morning, when she sat alone in the evening, when she caught herself thinking about the way he listened, the way he made even the simplest conversation feel meaningful. She didn't expect to see him again. Life didn't work like that, she thought. Some people enter your life only for a moment, leaving behind something you can't quite explain. But life has a way of surprising those who least expect it. One afternoon, as Ellie struggled to fix a loose wooden beam in her home, the pain in her side forced her to stop. She sat down, frustrated, staring at the unfinished work. For the first time in years, she admitted something to herself. She couldn't do everything alone. Reluctantly, she reached for her phone and searched for help. A local handyman service appeared, simple and straightforward. Without overthinking it, she made the call. And hours later, when there was a knock at her door, everything changed again. Because standing there, just as surprised as she was David. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Time seemed to pause, caught between disbelief and something far more powerful. David hadn't planned this. Taking on small repair work wasn't something he normally did. But after Ellie left the hospital, something inside him had shifted. He had started stepping outside his routine, trying to reconnect with parts of life he had long ignored. Helping people in simple, direct ways had become one of those changes. And somehow, against all odds, it had led him right back to her. Ellie broke the silence first, a soft laugh escaping her lips, half disbelief, half relief. David smiled in return, the tension easing instantly, replaced by something familiar and warm. What followed felt almost natural, as if the time apart had only been a pause, not an ending. David stepped inside, looking around her home, noticing the details she had once described. It was modest, filled with signs of effort and care, a reflection of who she was. As he worked on the repairs, their conversation resumed, not forced, not awkward, but steady and genuine. They spoke about what had happened since they last saw each other, about the strange coincidence that brought them together again, about the things they hadn't said before. But beneath the words, something deeper was growing. The boundaries that once existed between doctor and patient were gone. What remained was something more honest, more vulnerable. Two people standing in a moment that felt both unexpected and inevitable. At one point, David paused, looking at her with a seriousness that made her heart race. He admitted that he had thought about her more than he should have, that letting her leave without saying more had stayed with him. Ellie felt her breath catch, not because she was surprised, but because she had felt the same. For the first time, neither of them held back. There were no titles now, no rules, no expectations, just truth. And in that truth, something undeniable took shape. Because sometimes life gives you a second chance not to repeat the same moment, but to change it. And this time, neither of them was willing to let it pass. Some relationships don't begin with certainty. They begin with courage, with two people choosing to step into something unknown despite everything that could go wrong. For David and Ellie, that choice had already been made, even if neither of them had fully said it out loud yet. After that unexpected reunion, something shifted permanently between them. There was no longer a question of whether they would see each other again. The real question became how far they were willing to go. David started visiting her more often, sometimes under the simple excuse of checking on repairs, sometimes with no excuse at all. Each visit felt easier, more natural, as if the distance that once existed between their worlds was slowly disappearing. They shared meals, conversations, laughter, small moments that quietly built something meaningful. For Ellie, those moments felt almost unreal at first. She'd spent so much of her life relying only on herself that allowing someone in felt unfamiliar, even risky. But David's presence didn't feel like something she had to manage. It felt like something she could trust. For David, the change was just as profound. His life at the hospital continued, but it no longer defined him entirely. With Ellie, he found a different rhythm, one that didn't demand perfection, one that allowed him to simply exist without the constant pressure of responsibility. But as their connection deepened, so did the reality around them. David's professional world began to push back. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the distraction, the subtle shift in priorities, the way he spoke about life outside the hospital with a new kind of importance. Questions were raised, concerns disguised as advice. Some reminded him of his responsibilities, of the discipline required in his field, of how easily personal attachments could interfere with professional judgment. Others hinted at something more direct, that becoming involved with a former patient could raise ethical concerns, even if the situation had moved beyond its original boundaries. David listened, but something inside him resisted the weight of those expectations. For the first time, he questioned the life he had built so carefully. Was it truly complete if it required him to distance himself from something real? Ellie faced her own challenges, though they came from a different place. She wasn't worried about rules or professional boundaries. Her fear came from something deeper, something more personal. She began to wonder if she truly fit into David's world. He was educated, respected, surrounded by people who shared his level of knowledge and ambition. She, on the other hand, had built her life through necessity, through independence, through learning by doing rather than by studying. The difference didn't bother her at first, but slowly doubt began to grow. One evening, as they sat together in her home, the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Ellie finally spoke the words she had been holding back. She asked him if he ever felt like they were too different, if the life he lived and the life she knew could truly exist together without one of them having to change. David didn't answer immediately. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing not just the question, but the fear behind it. He told her that differences weren't what worried him. What worried him was the idea of losing something that felt real because of expectations that didn't belong to them. He admitted that his world was complicated, that it came with pressure and rules he couldn't ignore completely. But he also said that none of it mattered if it meant walking away from someone who made him feel more alive than anything else ever had. Ellie listened, her eyes filled with emotion she didn't try to hide. For someone who had always depended on herself, hearing someone choose her so clearly was both beautiful and terrifying. But love doesn't grow without risk. And slowly, carefully, she allowed herself to believe in what they were building. From that moment on, they stopped holding back. They didn't pretend things would be easy, but they chose each other anyway. They faced their doubts together instead of alone. They spoke honestly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. And in that honesty, something stronger than fear began to take shape. Because love is not about finding someone who fits perfectly into your life. It's about finding someone who makes you willing to redefine what your life can be. And as David and Ellie moved forward, step by step, they knew one thing for certain. What they had was no longer something they could ignore. It was something they had to fight for. Every love that dares to grow beyond comfort must eventually face a moment where everything is questioned, where doubt rises not to destroy it, but to reveal whether it is strong enough to endure. For David and Ellie, that moment came quietly, without warning, hidden beneath the surface of everything they had built together. At first, it was subtle, a shift in tone, a longer pause between words, a look that carried more thought than certainty. Life continued around them, but something underneath began to tighten, like a thread being pulled too far. David's responsibilities at the hospital intensified. A sudden increase in critical cases demanded more of his time, more of his focus, more of his energy. Long hours turned into exhausting days, and the emotional weight of his work grew heavier. The hospital needed him at his best, and being at his best meant giving everything he had. Ellie understood that. She respected his dedication, admired it even. But understanding something doesn't always make it easier to live with. She found herself spending more time alone again, the familiar silence returning to her home, the same silence she had once accepted without question. But now it felt different. It felt like something was missing. The contrast between their worlds became sharper. David moved between life and death decisions, surrounded by urgency and responsibility. Ellie remained in a life built on independence and routine, where everything depended on her own effort. Neither world was wrong, but the distance between them began to feel harder to ignore. One evening, after days without seeing each other, David finally arrived at her home, exhausted but relieved. He expected comfort, familiarity, the quiet connection that had always grounded him. Instead, he found tension. Ellie didn't hide it this time. She spoke honestly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She told him that she was proud of what he did, that she understood the demands of his life, but that she couldn't ignore how it made her feel. Like she was slowly becoming something secondary, something that existed only in the spaces left over after everything else. David listened, the weight of her words settling deeply. He hadn't intended for that to happen. In his mind, he was working harder to build a future, to become someone who could offer stability, security, something meaningful. But in doing so, he hadn't realized what it was costing in the present. For the first time, they stood on opposite sides of the same truth. Ellie feared being left behind. David feared failing both his purpose and the person he loved. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything neither of them knew how to solve. And then came the moment that truly tested them. Ellie, with quiet strength, said something that neither of them expected. She told him that she didn't want to become someone who waited for love only when it was convenient. That she had spent too much of her life being strong alone to now feel alone in something that was supposed to be shared. Those words didn't come from anger. They came from truth. And truth has a way of forcing clarity. David felt something shift inside him, something deeper than conflict. He realized that love was not something you fit into your life when there was time. It was something you chose actively, even when everything else demanded your attention. That night didn't end with perfect answers. It ended with something more important: awareness. The following days were different. Not easier, but intentional. David began to make changes, not dramatic ones, but meaningful ones. He set boundaries where he could, created time where there had been none, learned to balance responsibility with presence. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. Ellie, in turn, allowed herself to trust that effort. She didn't expect perfection. She didn't ask for more than he could give. But she needed to feel chosen, not occasionally, but consistently. And slowly, They found their rhythm again. Not the same as before, but stronger. Because now, their relationship was no longer built only on connection. It was built on understanding, on compromise, on the willingness to grow together instead of apart. One evening, as they stood side by side in her home, looking at a space they had slowly repaired together, David realized something with complete clarity. This wasn't just love. This was a life he didn't want to imagine without. And in that moment, every doubt that had once existed disappeared. Because when love survives distance, pressure, and truth, it becomes something unshakable. And what they had now was no longer uncertain. It was ready for the next step. Some endings are not really endings at all, but the quiet beginning of everything you were always meant to find. And for David and Ellie, the moment that would define their future came not with certainty, but with a choice that changed everything. Life had tested them in ways they never expected. It had placed distance between them, challenged their priorities, and forced them to confront truths that neither of them could ignore. But instead of breaking what they had built, those challenges had revealed something stronger, something rooted not just in feeling, but in commitment. David stood in the hospital one evening, looking around at the place that had defined so much of his life. The long hours, the responsibility, the constant pressure to be perfect, it was all still there. It would always be part of who he was. But for the first time, he understood that it didn't have to be everything. He thought about Ellie, about her strength, her independence, the quiet way she faced life without expecting anything from anyone. And he realized something that had taken him too long to see. She had never asked him to be less of who he was. She had only asked him to be present. And that was something he could choose. That night, he left the hospital earlier than usual, not because his work was less important, but because he had finally understood that love required intention, not just emotion. When he arrived at Ellie's house, the lights were on, the warm glow visible through the windows. It was a simple place, imperfect in many ways, but filled with something his world had often lacked: meaning. Ellie opened the door, surprised to see him, her expression shifting from confusion to quiet emotion. There was no tension this time, no unspoken distance. Just a moment waiting to be filled with truth. David didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, looked around at everything they had built together, the repaired walls, the small changes, the evidence of shared effort. And then he looked at her. He told her that for a long time, he believed that success was about sacrifice, that to be the best at what he did, he had to give everything, leaving nothing for anything else. But she had shown him that a life built only on achievement is incomplete if it leaves no space for love. He admitted that he couldn't promise perfection, that there would still be long days, difficult moments, times when life would test him again. But he could promise something far more important. He could promise that he would choose her, not once, not occasionally, but every day. Ellie felt her breath catch, her heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. She had always been strong alone, always capable of carrying her own life without depending on anyone. But standing there, hearing those words, she realized something she had never fully allowed herself to believe. That strength doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. David reached into his pocket, his movements calm but filled with meaning. When he revealed the ring, it wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to impress. It was simple, real, just like everything they had built together. He asked her to marry him, not as someone offering a perfect future, but as someone offering a shared one. A life where both of them could grow, struggle, and succeed together. Ellie didn't answer immediately, and in that brief silence, everything they had been through seemed to exist at once. The pain, the doubt, the distance, the moments that almost pulled them apart. And then she smiled. Not because everything was easy, but because it was real. She said yes. Their wedding wasn't defined by grand gestures or overwhelming luxury. It was defined by meaning. It took place in a place that mattered to them, surrounded by a small group of people who truly understood what their journey had been. There were no expectations to meet, no image to maintain. Just two people standing together, choosing each other in the most honest way possible. David looked at Ellie not as someone he had found by chance, but as someone who had changed the way he saw life itself. Ellie looked at David not as someone she depended on, but as someone she chose to walk beside. And as they exchanged their vows, something became clear in a way that words alone could never fully express. Their story had never been about perfect timing or easy circumstances. It had been about recognizing something real and having the courage to hold on to it, even when it was difficult. In the years that followed, their lives didn't become perfect, but they became meaningful. David continued his work, saving lives, carrying responsibility, but now with a balance he had once believed was impossible. Ellie continued to build her life, strong and independent, but no longer alone. Together, they created something that neither of them could have built on their own. A life not defined by sacrifice, but by choice. And sometimes, late in the evening, when everything was quiet, they would look at each other and remember how it all began. Not with a plan, not with certainty, but with a moment of vulnerability when one life crossed into another in the most unexpected way. Because in the end, the most powerful love stories are not the ones that begin perfectly. They're the ones that begin when you least expect them and still choose to last forever.